The reality we live in can be a very strange place. Most of the time, fact being stranger than fiction. How will we ever start to understand this reality we live in unless we question everything? Join me and a guest as we unravel the mysteries of this reality, one topic at a time. This is Inquiries of Our Reality with Shayn Jones.
What is up, Inquirers, and welcome to the place where we question the known to discover the unknown. I'm the one they call Shayn, and just like that motto I just said, today's guest definitely brings the heat, diving into some stuff that's kind of been underlaying within biblical context and also in old occult text and philosophy, and he brings it to the light, kind of brings a new perspective on it, and we of course kind of bring it into some more modern day concepts. I definitely think you guys are going to enjoy this episode. Today's guest always ends up killing it every single time he comes on the show, and this is now his fifth return, so definitely a fan favorite that I've gotten a lot of messages from you guys every single time he comes on that you guys want to see him again. So we'll definitely make sure we keep him in rotation as he's doing this awesome research and bringing in his interesting perspective and philosophy on things. But before we get into today's episode, of course, just a couple of quick news and updates. Bizarre Inquiries will be having a live that's coming up pretty soon here. I don't know the exact date, but it's either going to be the end of January or the beginning of February. So if anybody is interested in popping into that when it's live on YouTube, or if you guys want to submit some questions, articles, clips, any of that kind of stuff for us to discuss on the show, or if there are any other podcasters or anything you guys would like to see as a guest popping on that show, shoot us a message, let us know, follow on social media again, and you guys will hopefully get some more updates on when exactly we're going live. We probably will be announcing it a day or two ahead of time, and more than likely once we get everything up and rolling, it'll be a once a month live show on YouTube. It'll probably run about an hour or so, I think it'll probably end up going about 7 p.m. EST, so it might be a little bit easier for you guys to pop on versus the normal time I record, which is 9 p.m. But again, if that's something you're interested in, make sure you guys keep tabs, make sure you guys get a hold of us, submit them questions, articles, clips, all that fun stuff. And just another quick thing that I wanted to get some possible opinions on. I know everybody who listens to both the shows that I do, this one and Bizarre Encounters, of course, for anybody that doesn't listen to my other show, everybody kind of knows that the format over there, we do have some interviews, but for the most part, it's a lot of deep dives, but it's not as edgy as this show might be sometimes. So, kind of getting into certain philosophical things or conspiracies may not necessarily be the best format over there, but it's something that I'm thinking about bringing into this show. So I know you guys are used to the typical format as far as, it being interview style, but there's one of two ways that I can go about what I'm trying to do. Either one, I can run an episode completely by myself and kind of get into some of the stuff I wanted to discuss with you guys, different types of philosophy and my different thoughts on a few different other things. But the other way that I can go about it is that I can also bring on a fellow podcaster and kind of go back and forth with whoever that other podcaster is, and kind of bring in two different perspectives on some other things that have been kind of weighing on my mind, and different philosophical concepts and conspiracies that I want to get into with you guys. But give me your guys' opinions on whether or not you'd rather hear me riff with somebody else or possibly riff by myself, whatever you guys are kind of feeling. But I want to bring in some more to the format of this show and kind of, again, make the topics and everything talked about on this show a little bit more vast, and also kind of bring in different episode formats to the show to kind of bring you guys some fresh new material as far as Inquiries of Our Reality goes. And of course, talking about bringing in some new, fresh ideas and formats onto Inquiries of Our Reality. I'm still looking for new things to talk about on the show. So if you're somebody out there that, is like an author, a researcher, again, or even somebody that's had a bizarre experience, I definitely would love to have a conversation with you and talk about it on the show. So get a hold of me any way that you guys can, and I'd be more than happy to have you on. But leading off of that, of course, just a quick message. This podcast has a strong focus on community engagement, so I encourage all listeners to share their own experiences and research on the show. That said, if anyone would like to be a guest on the show, or if anyone has had an encounter or experience that they would like to share on the show, or possibly even have me investigate, you guys can get a hold of me at inquiriesofourrealitypodcast@outlook.com, or you guys can give the hotline a call, and that number is 313-364-1551. Text or call, whatever's easier for you guys when it comes to that hotline. And every single thing that I mentioned, including that number, is all available on the link tree and down in the show description, so you guys can find it quick and easy. And with that, let's get into the show. Please welcome to the show, for now his fifth return, artist, researcher, soon-to-be author. He's been working on it for about 2 years now, or since I've known the guy, but finally about to release it. Please welcome to the show, the infamous Robby Marx.
How you doing, man?
Not too bad, man. Always excited to get into a conversation with you. We always end up getting into these like super deep conversations, talking about philosophy, all these other fascinating things. And as usual, I heard that you got something really interesting to dive into today.
Yeah, so I had met with the editor about the book, and he basically wanted me to break a chapter up into two. So I basically have all this information about Attis and the goddess Kybele or Kybele or Sybil. So we're just kind of going to look at these ancient sacred temple builders and kind of follow that forward into the invention of theater and propaganda for the masses. So.
Awesome. Kind of continuing on with what we were talking about, I think, on the last time you were here when we were talking about the temples, and then a little bit before that when we were talking about the talking heads. So kind of bringing everything full circle a little bit. So definitely recommend everybody go back and listen to those episodes if you haven't, because it'll probably help to fill in some information on this episode.
Maybe so.
Hopefully.
But yeah, so as far as plugging myself, I'm Robby Marx, R. Marx, artist. I write. I do a variety of things. You can check out my art, my podcast, all my miscellaneous social media at Linktree at R Marx, and that'll pull up all my stuff for you. So, yeah.
Really glad that you finally set up the YouTube page, too, because I don't know if you had that set up fully last time we had talked. I think you were just starting to set it up, where you kind of put a place for every episode that you've been on. You're able to put it all in one place.
Yeah, that YouTube page I actually set up in, I want to say around 2012. And I have a couple videos on there of me drawing and doing some screen printing. But yeah, I should throw some of the episodes up there as well.
Hey, good news for you now. I upgraded finally again to Riverside. So if you wanted to, I could actually send you the video of this episode. So you can actually start uploading the video format of the episodes up on there, man.
Nice. Okay. Yeah, we can talk about it. So for sure.
But kind of hopping into everything, I know that you kind of usually have an outline on where you want to start, exactly where you want to get into everything. So I guess I'll pass the mic over to you for a little bit and kind of get everybody started on, where you want to get started with this information today.
Yeah, so what we're going to talk about really are these ancient sacred temple builders. And we're kind of going back even pre-deluge, before the flood, back to ancient Atlantis and kind of the times of, the civilization there where the fallen ones had come down and, were breeding with the earth women, right? But it was the fifth generation after Adam where you have Lamech. And he basically had children that kind of put together what they call the seven sacred sciences, right? So these are what we would more modern terms think of as the trivium and the quadrivium, where you essentially have logic, rhetoric, and grammar, and then you have what is it, the line and the geometry, and it gets into music and astronomy. And so basically you have these, what they call the seven sacred sciences, that they had kind of facilitated and grown. And when they found out that the flood was coming, they took and they inscribed all of this sacred information on these two pillars, right? And one of the pillars was said to be put together by a pre-diluvian Hermes, whereas the other one was put together by one of Lamech's children. And basically one was of lattice work, so that it would not burn, and the other one was made of stone. So it basically it was the idea it wouldn't burn, and it wouldn't sink. They would be stable like information, so that they would survive this coming catastrophe that was facing the earth, right?
So assumably this is where the two pillars come in when you start getting into like Freemasonry. And I don't remember the names of the two pillars. It was Bohad and
Yakin and Boaz are the Masonic pillars. Yeah. And you can kind of take those Masonic pillars and trace them back to the pillars at Solomon's temple, which we're going to get into with these sacred temple builders, right? And you can trace those back to the king of Tyre in, Persia. And basically, so that's the thing. So the king of Tyre, when Solomon needed the finished masons for Solomon's temple, right? He talked to the king of Tyre, which was King Hiram, which the masons relate to one of the masters of their order, right? So this King Hiram, he basically went to this certain area. It's Byblos. You hear about it's a Phoenician city, right? This is the city that when Osiris very first got trapped in the lead box. Are you familiar with that story?
For anybody that might not be, might as well just fill them in since you brought it up.
Okay, so in Egyptian mythology, and the Masons really embody this story as part of the Masonic philosophy, right? So Osiris and Isis are basically in Egypt, and then Osiris's brother is Set. And basically Set is jealous of him with Isis, and so he kind of really hates his brother Osiris, so he plots to kill him. So basically he measures his shadow to determine his exact height, right? And he creates this bejeweled box that's like all encrusted in gems and minerals and absolutely beautiful. And it's kind of like the Cinderella story, where essentially, everybody at the party and Set says, whoever fits in this box, then they can take this home with them, this beautiful encrusted jewel box, right? And so one by one, the members of the party, they, try to get in the box, and they're too fat and they're too short. And, and finally Osiris comes and he gets in the box, and he's a perfect fit. And they basically nail the cover on it, right? And seal it with lead. And they carry it away before Isis even knows what's happening, right? Isis ends up hearing it from some children on the street that basically they'd carried him away in a box, right? And they basically throw this box into the Nile River, and it floats down to Byblos, where it is encased inside of a tamarisk tree, right? So there's a king there, King Melkort. He comes and he's like out on kind of caravan, and they find this, just big tamarisk tree that has this beautiful smell emanating from it. And the king, he's really impressed with it. So they basically cut it down and they make it a pillar in his temple. So Isis, she finally comes and finds this pillar. Some say it was because of this smell that it was excreting, right? And she explains to King Melkort, that Osiris is in the pillar. And so they cut the pillar open, and Osiris falls out, and then Thoth comes with a magic elixir, kind of a tea, and they feed it to him, and he's revived, and they take him back to Egypt, and Set sees he's alive and kills him again, right? Well, this town where the box is subsumed in the tamarisk tree, is basically where these Gibbum, these they call them the freehand finish masons of Solomon's temple, right? So the king of Tyre, he calls up these Gibbum who worship this this first death of Osiris, right? And it's also tied in with Attis worship and Adonis worship. It kind of ties into this whole philosophical idea of these demasculated kingmen that die and are resurrected that you see kind of through history, right? So these Gibbum that the king of Tyre, King Hiram call up and sends to Solomon's temple, and they do all the super fine finish work, and they do all the like beautiful carvings and the blue lotuses on the tops of the pillars around the temple, and basically they are just accredited and known for their attention to detail and fine workmanship, right? So these Gibbum from Byblos, they're basically in the same region where Attis worship is going on, and Attis and they basically worship Attis, and Attis is this character that there's numerous different stories, but what ends up happening is this figure Sybil or Kybele or Kybele falls in love with Attis, and she doesn't know she's a queen because the father had given her up, and nonetheless they fall in love, and then the king finds out his daughter's still alive, and she's like gonna marry this like lowly kind of peasant that is Attis, right? So they basically set it up. So some stories they tape his genitals to his leg, and when he wakes up, they rip off. And some he basically, because he can't marry Kybele or Kybele, he demasculates himself with a shard from a terracotta pot. There's all these different stories, but nonetheless, this is the character that these Gibbum are kind of worshiping, that are kind of this carryover of this Osiris character. We're talking about, like hundreds, if not thousands of years later. Right. So this is the character it's kind of morphed into. And so go ahead.
Is this like like the same type of character that maybe something more like Baphomet or possibly would be kind of inspired from? Because it kind of has this connotation of like this like half masculine, half feminine type of idea. Energy. And obviously a lot of this stuff is like rooted in way farther back traditions. Oh, yeah. And then it kind of gets recycled in. So I'm assuming this is somewhat of like the origin of those type of characters or archetypes.
Yeah, and I mean, even with the story of like Zeus demasculating Kronos with the help of Mother Rhea and the little scythe, that story goes back to Kumbari in the Atal Mountains. And basically, so, as these myths kind of move, they shift and morph, but at the time in Byblos, these Gibbum were basically worshipers of Attis, right? So then it says that with Attis, and Adonis is in that category as well, with the boar and the whole 40 days of Lent and the Easter ham. That the Easter celebration is the same celebration as for Attis, is the same celebration for Adonis, and it's this idea of the death and the resurrection, very much how Jesus is, crucified and put in the tomb, and then 3 days later risen up. All these kind of holidays happen on the same kind of spring equatorial equinox kind of time, right? And in the old texts it say that Dionysus carried away Attis, right? And so you got to look at kind of these temple builders, right? They were responsible for building all the sacred temples of worship and the outdoor sacred spaces, and they basically built all these ideas up around geometry, one of the 7 sacred sciences that we talked about before. And they were basically using sacred numbers for like distribution of proportion, and those ideas of that temple building moved from Southeast Asia, through Byblos, through Tyre, into Solomon's temple, and this group of these sacred temple builders, the Masonic orders, they basically tie themselves back to this exact group of these Gibbum. And the Gibbum or the Gibellum are secret words in Freemasonry as you progress through the various levels of initiation into that mystery. And these as well were mystery schools too. So you have this whole initiatory factor. Basically, they said they would present the ideas of the mysteries to you in the lower degree, and then as you progressed, they would explain what those things were in higher forms, and then you get into Albert Pike with the Freemasons and the 33-degree system. And, a lot of people said that he was just pimping out degrees at that point, but these elites, they always wanted to get into these different occult orders and go through these different degree process, because there was secret hidden wisdom that they thought they would gain as they were going through these mystery schools,
Hold on tight, everyone. Inquiries of Our Reality will be right back after this brief commercial break. But if you don't mind taking a second to follow Inquiries of Our Reality on Instagram and Facebook, and Open Minds Media on YouTube and TikTok, I'd greatly appreciate it. And feel free to spark up a conversation. I love getting to know you guys. And now back to the show. And I'm assuming that this stuff, kind of depending on which kind of viewpoint you view it from, because you've kind of brought this connection in with like the Greek mythology and with Egyptian mythology. But I know that you study a lot of stuff from like the biblical perspective. So do you kind of get into the camp that a lot of this stuff may have actually been like the fallen angels, and they just gave different names to these things, and that's kind of where it all ties back in with Freemasonry, that it's a matter of perspective, that, a lot of people think that they're, praying to, a lot of these like ancient Greek figure or ancient Egyptian figures, but realistically, it's actually the fallen angels, just under different names as they've gone through different regions and different places. And assumably that these 7 sciences are actually, assumably some of the stuff that the fallen angels would have given, right?
Right. Because they what was it? Enoch. He said that the fallen angels, they gazed into the mysteries and then taught them to mankind, and that was one of their sins, basically, right? And if you get into the biblical perspective of all this, and the rabbinical, as far as what the rabbis say, the altar that was built, as far as Adam's altar, as far as the altar for Abraham, and the killing, or the how he was gonna sacrifice his son Isaac. That altar, when you look at a couple different various places biblically and from the Judaistic standpoint, it was said that the altar had to be built with natural hewn stones, that there could be no chiseled stone or mortar involved. So there's this whole idea that, what the Freemasons are, or what Masonry is outside of what the biblical scope is, in opposition to, essentially, because you couldn't have Masons come and build the altar. It had to be natural, like river stone, or natural, mountain stone. And yeah, it is interesting, because also when you get into the origins of Freemasonry, they accredit Nimrod with being the very first Freemason. And then it was the architect of the Tower of Babel, Peleg, who was called the Grand Architect. So all this stuff kind of plays into, the story of Freemasonry, or Messianic, or, philosophy and thought, kind of.
it's kind of weird how that ends up kind of flipping, because I was kind of hearing something today, and it's something that I kind of thought about, but not fully in that perspective. And I'm not saying like flip perspectives or anything like that, but it's just interesting to hear stuff from different perspectives. And when you kind of go back into the idea that basically like the whole thing with like Freemasonry, what they kind of believe with like the Garden of Eden and everything was that, you know, the serpent was the one that was wisdom, the one that was supposed to make people aware and give them all this knowledge. And they basically viewed it as like, you know, God wasn't giving them this knowledge, so that was unfair to them because he's, you know, making them live in this place of like bliss without actually being aware and having knowledge and knowing like how to manipulate and how to like do things with the world around you. So in turn, they end up like flipping this idea where when you start reading into like their literature and their philosophy, it's basically this idea that, you know, they obviously have this huge grasp for knowledge and they want to keep this knowledge a secret. Yet on the other side, they kind of view this thing where like Lucifer or the serpent is like the good figure that wanted to bring them knowledge, and they demonized the other one like he was taking away knowledge from them that they deserved, even though ironically now it's the opposite. It's like, we have the knowledge, you guys aren't allowed to have it. So exactly the thing that they're against, which kind of brings in their religious viewpoint, is exactly like what they do to society now in a weird way. Like
yeah, it is interesting, the whole diametric disposition of the whole thing. And so, you know, when you look at the Masonic orders, you know, they say they're taking the rough, you know, man and basically hewing him or, you know, refining him into the true block. You know, whereas if you go back into these, you know, sacred temple builders that are coming out of Southeast Asia and coming into Greece, and a lot of the old historians accredit the style and the structure of the Grecian buildings to these sacred temple builders, coming from the Gibbum, coming from those that were, you know, building Solomon's temple, because, you know, you have very much the pillars, and you have the, you know, it's a lot of the same kind of philosophical elements of the temple itself, you know, but the temples themselves were actually built in the manner of the human body, with the different parts of the temple relating to the heart and the mind and you know, the different functions. There was
does that kind of play in with the Egyptian thing too, where like they removed like the specific organs? Is it supposed to also like represent that also? And
for sure.
It's assumably the same organs that they remove for the same views with the like Egyptian philosophy.
Right. So Schwaller de Lubavitch, he wrote this whole book. It's not a very big book. It's like 120, 140 pages, but it's about the Temple of Luxor and how it basically, the different chambers as you move through it, and the way that it's situated is essentially the standing human, you know. And then you get into the Asian temples, and they believe that the temple was modeled after an individual that was laying down on the ground. And that, you know, and then with the church steeple, it's the idea that, you know, you have the heart, which is the altar, and then the asp is, you know, all these different parts play into the different organs, and then the mind itself would be the steeple or the shaft that kind of shoots into heaven, and is that factor that animates, you know. And even in Egypt, they would have the cobra that would be on their head, and that symbolized the idea and the act of the idea striking out to take a hold of reality, to actually, you know, form it in your own, you know, mind shape. So this idea of these temples being related to the workings of the human body, and as you would go through the mysteries, you'd be enlightening the mind, and basically, as things were happening in the individual, you know, within the temple, those things could also be related to the movements of the stars and how things were happening, you know, as above, so below.
I mean, another weird thing to think about too, when you start diving into like Egyptian stuff, you know, they came up with this whole idea that the pyramids were intended for, you know, leaving the pharaohs and everything, like it was like their burial place. But then when they were actually asking around like the locals, like what the what the pyramids were for, like what their purpose was, they said they represent us. And it was just this weird thing that stuck with me when I used to dive into Egyptian stuff, this whole idea that they would always say they represent us. But viewing it with that piece of information, it kind of takes on a totally different view of what the pyramids could possibly mean, because I know a lot of people have theories on it, but if they quote represent us and they also align with the stars, I mean, it doesn't necessarily throw out the idea that they could have been some type of place for conducting power, because in a way the body does that too. And maybe it is representing us, and it's formed in the aspect of the human body to be able to create and replicate energy. I mean, just a kind of different weird way of viewing it, but I feel like the whole temple idea with it represents us definitely also fits in with what they were doing with these other temples.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. Yeah, it is. I mean, the more you get into this stuff, it really makes a lot of sense from a perspective and worldview. But it's, you know, and you get into the temples themselves, and I think what we have left, where the temples are now, are basically the end of this temple system, where the system itself kind of broke down, because they would actually, you know, take temples and break them down and then rebuild them somewhere else, you know, and basically move them in accordance with, you know, how things were moving in the heavens. And what is it, Edward Leedskull down in Florida, you know, how he moved Coral Castle because he said that the ley lines had changed, you know, kind of similar kind of thing there, you know. But yeah.
Maybe something with the ancient sciences where you're talking about like geometry and everything. I feel like that plays in with this whole like vibrational concept, because it seems like it's one of those things that there's a lot to unlock with vibration and frequency. And it's always been something that's talked about in occult circles, in spiritual practice forever. And it's just now in the past like 10 years starting to become something that they seem to be doing a lot more with in science, or I'm sure they've been doing it, but it's become more like the mainstream kind of knows about it, which, you know, how far are they really into this type of stuff. But I mean, that idea would definitely make sense, because maybe it's something with like the ley lines, they give off like a different frequency or a different like magnetic positive or negative or something at certain times. So in turn, it's like, you know, if somebody tries to do this practice, it's not going to work unless it's at a specific time, maybe like a certain time of year when like something is resonating or vibrating differently. And then it's just like you have a key opportunity where you're able to do this in a short period of time, where you can basically push these blocks and they're almost like no weight, because it's almost like it's like a negative pulse. Like if you put like, you know, a negative and a negative, or a south pole and a south pole together, like they push off of each other and want to sit on top, and you can basically hover and float it as long as you have a big enough area where you have this
secure it.
This area where you can reflect off each other. And it won't just shoot off.
And interestingly, even CERN, one of the reasons that they shut down before for repairs for so long, they said that the particle accelerator itself, that big tube, was actually it levitated off of the footings and it broke the footings, and so they had to go in and reinforce it and secure it, you know. So I think there is definitely something to resonance, frequency, you know, vibration, and how, you know, with quantum physics, they proved that the observer affects the outcome. So, you know, there's something way more kind of cosmic going on than just, you know, sheer matter. I mean, I think will has a lot to do with it as well.
I mean, even on the other side too, I wonder if it's something that's, you know, if you can only do it at certain times or certain places, I wonder if it might be something that's maybe, you know, they're following the stars. So maybe it has something to do with like the location of where the planet's sitting in space. And it isn't necessarily something that's radiating from the Earth, but rather like a pocket in space, that it's something that we're not fully aware of at this time, but like maybe energy just works differently in it. Like it's almost like a negative hole that you can't necessarily like view it or see it, but there's like a different energy change. So like they would follow, you know, when the stars would align at certain spots, because then they would know where the planet's sitting specifically in space. And like I said, it's not the planet itself sitting in a certain way, but like rather where its location is, like around the sun, because assumably you know, the magnetic frequency or the magnetism that's coming from the sun is going to shift at different locations depending on where you're sitting next to it too.
Right. Well, and when you go back to the mysteries of Isis, the lower mysteries of Egypt, right? They would watch the dog star, which to the Masons was Merca, which a lot of people relate to America,
I was
right?
about to say.
Yeah, yeah. But that dog star, basically, it would be in the underworld, essentially, where you couldn't see it within the turning of the zodiac, right? And at a certain point of the year, it would begin to rise on the horizon, and that would alert the worshippers of Isis that the Nile was about to flood. So, and as soon as that came up, they would all prepare for the flood, and they saw the flood as basically in the olden times when the waters had basically subsumed everything during the flood. So they saw this as a renewal of the earth itself, very much like how the flood had renewed everything. Every year when this flood came, they saw it as, subsuming the land, and then that would bring the silt that would basically give all the growing ability for the plants, coming downstream. But when that sun would at the peak of summer, right, around the solstice time, that you've heard the term the dog days of summer, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so when Sirius at high noon would basically go behind the sun, right? That's when they basically said was the dog days of summer, right? And that sun, that would be the sun behind the sun, which kind of plays into the whole black sun. And the idea is kind of when you get into a lot of those, the sun behind the sun, or the black sun of the alchemists, kind of playing in that reign. But at the same time, this was, and the Egyptians, they would actually measure the depth of the Nile at its peak to determine the tax rate for the city. And if it was low, you get a low tax rate. If it was high, you get a high because the higher it was, the more silt it was carrying down. So the more prosperous that the year would be, so they had this whole system that had developed for thousands and thousands of years, just basically based on, this dog and the dog star or Merca, within Freemasonry, there is some writing about that being a white dragon, basically, hidden in there. That is the sun behind the sun. But they developed this whole system all based on, the movement of this singular body in the heavens,
And at that time, were they into, I don't know if I've dived this far into it before, but like into like moon worship, where they knew that like the moon would play a factor as far as like the tides and everything would go? Or was it mainly like they were kind of gearing everything around the sun at this time, and they weren't really like taking the moon into consideration with like, the sun would seemingly do things with like energy, magnetism, like things like that with the planet, right, where the moon itself, for whatever reason, seems to have this like other magnetic pulse where it'll like, again, push the tides and like manipulate the water on the earth, which
right.
I've always been kind of curious exactly how that works, but I'm curious if these people are aware of it at this time, because they seem to be aware of all this stuff that they should have been, like DNA strains, like all this stuff.
Yeah. But when you look at the sun, that was a representation of Ra, and Ra would basically rise every morning at the horizon, the Horus zone, and basically as he would go through the day, he would have different symbols that he was, and what was it, when at high noon, when the Nile was flowing at its peak, they called the Nile River the Kennet. But at high noon was when Ra was at his greatest strength, right? But now the moon was more representative of Isis herself, as far as the mysteries that no man shall ever lift her veil, right? And she, what did she say at one point? She said, although my journey may have begun in darkness, it can only but end in light. Because of the way the moon rides in the night sky and in the day sky, and then you have the solar cycle, which is related to the 30-day or the 31 day cycle that we use now, versus the moon, Isis, being related with that lunar cycle of the 28 days, 13 months, basically affecting the tides, the rhythms, when the planting seasons, you always plant, right before the full moon or the new moon, so that as the moon grows, it's cosmically pulling those plants. So all of these different bodies, Sirius, the sun, the moon. When you get into the Egyptian chambers, one of them goes to one star system and the other one goes to Orion's belt. So there's these, just within every aspect of Egyptian, society, they were following these bodies in the heavens and how they moved, and saw them in relation to higher forms of energy.
Hold on tight, guys. We have to take a break and pay some bills. But if you guys don't like hearing the ads, then I have a solution for you. You guys can get ad-free and early access to this show and Bizarre Encounters with Shayn and Orin on the Open Minds Media Patreon for just $1 a month. And it's a great way to support this show and all the hard work behind it. And if you're interested in merch store discounts, live access to episodes, or premium video versions of episodes, then there are a few other tiers with additional benefits with 7-day free trials available. And we are back, so let's hop right in. I mean, connecting something else too, it seems like the sun always represents masculine energy and the moon always represents feminine energy. But I don't know if that starts with the Egyptians or where it starts exactly, but assumably it's like one thing inspires the next thing. But I don't know if you've ever dug into it, but have you ever figured out why exactly, like, I've had some theories, of course, but like why the sun always represents masculine and the moon always represents feminine?
You go back to the divine feminine cults of Mu and Lemuria, and they basically worship the divine feminine energy. So therefore, they had beliefs more related to the movements of the moon. Whereas within the masculine perspective, they follow the sun. So it depends on the society. And there were some, like in Japan, the moon was seen as a male personification. When you get into the character of sin, like in the Bible, how it says, "Go and sin no more." That was one of the moon gods. That was more down in the African coast, and basically, it was a male personification of the moon. So there are some. They switch back and forth. It just depends. You got to figure at one point, all these cultures were kind of bubbles. And then as they came in contact with one another, like kind of beliefs started crossing and intermixing. And then you have the rise of these mystery schools coming out of Phrygia and coming out of Lydia and coming out of, and even with Isis and Osiris, Osiris says that Saturn is her father. And you go to Phrygia, and the words Saturn and mystery are Phrygian words. So, there's ties between the cult of Isis and the cult of the goddess, going back to Mother Kybele, coming out of Phrygia. There's always been this lineage of these mother goddess cults that kind of, tie in from, even in the beginning, balance itself, being justice, was a goddess, and then that ties in with liberty and this sacred dove that became the white dove of the Holy Spirit, that goes all the way back to Ishtar, Inanna, and talking about this sacred balance within, the cosmos. So it's kind of, you have this divine lineage of female goddesses, and then you have this other lineage which brings in the mystery schools and the sacred builders, which is the cult of Osiris, turning into the cult of Attis, getting carried away by the cult of Dionysus, coming into Greece, and basically those sacred temple builders are, basically coming through on the ride and basically building these cultures up as they're going.
which kind of brings it all back to, again, one thing inspiring all of it. And then you started connecting the dots between all this stuff, and it kind of goes back into, again, that like whole fallen angels concept. But just to make another comment on the whole like masculine and feminine thing with the moon, I always assumed it was something like, the sun represent power. Like that's the masculine. It's the big, it's the strong one, where like the moon represented like the feminine, because it was this idea that it was like peaceful at night. Like everything was quiet, everything is like gentle and like smaller and like more peaceful with the moon. So I assume that was kind of where the idea came in, is like it was the power versus like the peaceful, which again goes into like duality with like male, female energy and back and forth. But I'm sure there's some type of like inspiration starting with the fact that like they always viewed the masculine as the more powerful. So of course the sun's always going to, for the most part, going to have that connotation of being the strong, powerful one.
Right. And there was also this idea that the sun was emanating its life force. It was emanating, a triune life force of, heat and light and life itself, essentially, that underlying factor that precipitated, life in form and coming about and feeding, all those things. Whereas the moon is generally seen more in regard to the nighttime, the dark. And there's a lot of ideas behind it. Breaks things down in regard to the death and the funguses and the moss and the things that kind of eat the things that are in states of death, for the purpose of revivifying and renewing and giving the life force so things can grow.
See, I was going to say, it seems like it might also represent like the womb, where it's like darkness and the womb.
Oh, yeah.
So that's the place where everything can kind of restart and resettle, so that when it comes to the light, then it can, be alive again. So I feel like it also, in a weird way, the darkness represents like the womb itself.
Yeah. And depending on the temples, the Greeks, they represented, the goddess form in, Diana, and they represented the god form in everything from Mithra to Dionysus. And with Dionysus, this is another line of those sacred builders, right? That basically were quote unquote said to have carried Attis away from Byblos, basically bringing that into Greece. And these Dionysians, when you look at Dionysus, he was one of the first Olympians after the wars between Mount Olympus and the old gods. When the old gods were basically, put into Tartarus, or the black cube in the center of the earth, and the Mount Olympian gods took over. And they celebrated games. And Dionysus was one of the very first Olympians that kind of, was celebrating Zeus, Father Zeus, defeating the old gods. But Dionysus, his mother, so Zeus's wife, Hera, was jealous when she found out about Dionysus's mother and Zeus kind of getting together, right? So Hera tricked Dionysus's mother, and Shemeli, that's her name, and basically was like, because Zeus would always appear to everyone in different forms. You have Leda and the goose, you have the white bull from the sea, you have these different forms. So Hera was like, you need to tell him you want to see him in his true form, right? So Shemeli was like, I need to see you in your true form. And so Zeus was like, well, you may not live. And she's like, I don't care. I just want to see who you really are. So he takes off his like appearance, and he's like this bright, effulgent light that kind of, is electric kind of just fries her. Like as soon as she looks at him.
This still sounds like it plays into the biblical paradigm. Like this sounds like when people see angels or see like, these other beings that they talk about in the Bible, like still it plays along the same line, man.
Yeah. So basically she turns to dust, right? But baby Dionysus the son of Zeus, is in her womb. And so he's laying there in the ashes, and Zeus basically picks him up and sews him into his thigh. And then, he gestates in there, and he's reborn again as Dionysus. And, but, you look at the statues from over there, and it's all these figures, and they have these giant eyes with huge pupils, right? And I've seen some evidence that the cult of Dionysus, and Dionysus had the Maenads, which were these women that basically were devotees that would basically, when they would get initiated into the mystery school, so Dionysus would carry this staff that had like a pine cone on top, and it was called a thyrsus, and it had, some grape leaves kind of draping down, which plays later into Bacchus, right? Because Dionysus, in the shift from Greece to Rome, Dionysus basically becomes Bacchus. That becomes his new name, right? But Dionysus, with that thyrsus, they would make, I've read some accounts, they would make this blue honey, which all I can guess is that it's like psilocybin or psilocybe mushrooms, and basically in the honey, and he would dip the thyrsus in the honey and go around and anoint people on their foreheads with it, and it would run down your face and into your mouth, and then they would get into this orgiastic state where these dyads, yeah, they would roam through the countryside, beating drums, and like if anything got in their way, they would grab it and they would rip it apart and devour it in an orgiastic frenzy, is what you always see, and there was one case where Dionysus drove this one king mad, and the dyads went in and ripped him apart and ate him, and he constantly drove people into states of frenzy and madness was one of his qualities, but again, and these were these temple builders that were building these temples and basically having these mystery schools where people were getting initiated, into these higher levels of thinking, essentially.
See, this is something that I've thought about a lot, actually. The whole idea of like the psychedelic realm and these like natural, like psychedelics, essentially, like that. Everybody kind of has this idea of this like peace, love, unity concept when you take psychedelics. But on the other side, I mean, when you start diving into like the whole concept of, for lack of better terms, like demons, and the fact that they know how to manipulate people into thinking that there's something different than they actually are, everybody kind of has this idea of like, oh, demons exist in the dark. They're all these like dark, evil looking creatures, but not having the idea that like, this all started essentially with the fallen angels, which would have been these like beautiful, brightly colored like creatures. So, I mean, the psychedelic realm that people talk about, like, they're thinking that they're seeing these like interdimensional beings, but like realistically, like, is that actually like the demon realm? Like, are you seeing like, quote, these fallen angels, these disembodied beings and all these things? And the reason why it seems like psychedelic practice plays a role in all of these different societies is because they know that that's that direct connection to the gods, possibly. And I mean, on the other side too, I mean, you even dive into the Bible and you hear like the burning bush, and I believe it was like Arcadia bush or something like that, which also would have had like
acacia bush. It was the highest. Yeah, it had the highest ratio of DMT of any plant in the region.
See, so it makes you wonder too if it's a matter of like the person themselves that, if you're like a lower frequency individual, or, maybe it has to do with intention too, that if you're somebody that's like seeking knowledge from this other side, that, you're going to knock the door on that realm. But on the other side, if you're like a true hearted, God loving individual, then you'll have these experiences. Instead of opening that door, you end up opening a different door because you're vibrating at like a different frequency, at a different rate, for example. So you open up a different doorway when you take these things. But I feel like there's a lot of tricks with these new age concepts that, if this is, as I'm theorizing that it might be, that a lot of these new agey concepts seem to be inspired by a lot of these old occult principles, which again, you go back even farther into that, and then it goes back to the fallen angels. So like they're masquerading under these bright, colorful lights, but they're not that at all. They're, actually
spiteful energies that are trapped in the matrix and can't leave until what they call omega point, at the end of time, when all of matter and time is dissolved and they can leave being trapped within. And we've gone into this before in regard to those watchers coming down, breeding with earth women, and as they kind of phased out, the bodies that they were creating through this interbreeding of this higher force and the earthly force was creating vessels for these energies to come into. But the thing was, when they died, that, you know, and you got Asian texts that say this, you have rabbinical texts that say this, you have points in the Bible that kind of say this as well, that these energies, they get trapped in matrix. They get trapped in the third dimensional realm of matter and space-time, and they can't leave, and they go into the ground. Like in the Persian text, you always hear the demons are in the ground, and they would dig pits and fill it up with blood to basically bring the demons, you know, when they were using the teraphims. But it always comes back to this idea that these energies are spiteful against humans, and they're kind of laying in wait in this stasis state, you know, waiting for that omega point, which is liberty or liberation for them.
I mean, hell takes on a totally different connotation when you view it from that point, because, like, you know, everybody kind of wonders the whole disembodied thing, how that plays in with the Nephilim, the fallen angels, and everything. But, you know, if you have these fallen angels that are casted out of heaven, they can't go back to heaven. They have children. These children have these souls that also aren't allowed back in heaven. You know, where do these disembodied souls go?
They're other disembodied energy, you know, fallen higher energies that are entering into physical form through these vessels that are created, you know. So you have this whole, you know, and what was it, Lilith, when she abandoned Adam, you know, before they did the whole, you know, rib and creating Eve, Lilith basically said some magic words and kind of flew out of Eden, and she ended up in the Red Sea with the angel Samael, that is basically the lord of this realm. And it said they were just breeding out millions and millions of these demonic forms in some of the texts, you know.
So, I mean, even like the whole hell concept kind of takes on a different connotation, because people kind of view it as, you know, like heaven's like this other place that might exist somewhat in a different reality almost. Like it's a place that you can't just get to from like our physical reality. But if you're viewing it from the standpoint that these things are trapped in this reality, then hell seems like it's a lot more of like a physical concept, or, you know, all the different names for what different variations of hell. But it seems like, again, they bury themselves down. So the whole idea of hell, people think about it as being in a different realm, but it's not a different realm. It's that they buried themselves down and that they found like an area that they could exist in, but it's this more physical place than like heaven is, where heaven is like existing almost like in a different place, or like in a simultaneous reality in the same place. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back after this brief commercial break. And we are back to the show. So let's hop right in.
And when you get into the the second book of Enoch, the Slavic secrets, there's a whole section in there where Enoch is being taken into the heavens by the angel Gabriel, and they come into the I think it's the fourth realm, where they encounter these fallen Nephilim after they had died, and they're like frozen in place, and they're like really dehydrated and kind of like, you know, really dry, and like their expression, they can't move, and they're like caught in time, and they're just waiting, you know, in that kind of empty place until the end of time. But then when you read some of the rabbinical texts, they talk about the idea that Tartarus itself, which is essentially hell, that Tartarus, almost like at the end of time, they're going to take all the fallen ones and basically throw them into Tartarus and then zip it up, and it will be like they never existed in the timescape.
That's kind of weird to think about, because like when you bring in the book of Enoch, it starts getting into these like weird quantum physics concepts. And I know I've said it a million times on this show, but like you take something magical and then you start understanding it with a science, and then it actually turns into a science, like alchemy into chemistry. So it's you know, all of these weird different concepts with, the Book of Enoch, which is like why we threw it out, because it didn't make any sense at the time. Now it's connecting in with like astrophysics. So it's like we're starting to have like an understanding in science of this. And I feel like there's a lot more of an understanding of quantum physics, but it's a matter of also, these people that are in charge of this type of stuff, the secret knowledge, they want to muddy the water so people don't exactly know what the information they have is. So it's like, not to start up like a whole new conspiracy, but it makes you wonder with like astrophysics, how many people might intentionally be using misdirection so that people don't become aware of these ancient mysteries.
Right. So even with back to the moon and Isis, right? Thoth, the Atlantean, the pre-Diluvian magician that was there at the beginning of time and saw Ra come out of the effulgent Lucas or pillar of light, right? So Thoth was there at the very beginning, but he is called the secretary of Isis, right? Thoth actually rides in the moon with Isis and is considered to be, quote unquote, the dark side of the moon, as the secret wisdom that the divine nighttime feminine energy kind of holds. That is the veil that no man shall ever lift. So, these secrets, these ancient mysteries are considered to be and when you get into the idea of the divine feminine and the divine masculine again, from the beginning, you have the Leviathan and the Behemoth, right? And the Leviathan is considered this divine feminine energy that kind of sinks down and, quote unquote, in the texts, they say she's salted. She basically becomes cubic matter, which is, like the carbon, 6 electrons, 6 protons, 6 neutrons, so basically she becomes salted. She becomes physical matter itself. Whereas the Behemoth is this bull that has all this virile energy that is related to Nimrod. You can get into some of the various sun worship. The Apis bull, which is the resurrected soul of Osiris, is carried in the Apis bull. And it's interesting. Then the Apis was the Apis bull in Egypt, but in Greece, in Greek, the Apis was the bee. So there's this interrelationship between all these different forces, these different animals. It's it's some pretty cosmic mysticism when you really start going down these roads.
I mean, even kind of a weird thing to think about. You said carbon has 666, right?
Yeah.
So if you start thinking about that one, we're carbon-based beings, and then you kind of bring in this whole idea that, they're trying to alter genetics. It almost seems like, again, it's kind of like unlocking Pandora's box, that they're messing with like the structure that started with a 666. And even on the other side, getting into some like more modern day type of conspiracies with all this like fascination with like carbon tax, this, that. It's like 666 is like hitting all over the place, and it's all over the news, all over everything, and people aren't even catching it.
It's literally a 666 tax. The carbon tax per se.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying.
Yeah. But so now you have that carbon you have that carbon structure, or that cube essentially, right? Which is the 6-sided cube, which gets into Kaaba. It gets into the Greek myths of the black cube at the center of the earth. It gets into the Jacob's pillow shooting into the center of the earth. It gets into all these different philosophies in regard to this mystical black cube of Saturn, which, I've gone down all those roads.
You unlock human genetics, you're essentially unlocking 666, correct? Like that's like the whole weird idea behind it too. So even that's symbolic all on its own.
Oh yeah. And the mark of the beast is, the beast is us, and the mark of the beast is 666. But if you take that cube, right, that has 6 sides, it has 8 corners, which is on a higher level, moving to the Ogdoad and, transversing dimensionally, within the vibrational frequency from a lower astral form to a higher astral form, all this sacred geometry, going back to those 7 sacred sciences, with geometry being the 5th sacred science, and with that 5, when in the Hebrew, within the rabbis' writings, they say that when man was ejected from the heavens, that he had a number 5 branded on his forehead. You get into the pentagram, right? That's said to be the representation of the human, the standing human upright. And then you take that pentagram and roll it on its head, and that's riding the goat within the esoteric philosophies, but it's also turning the man on his head, which, then you can put the goat in the upside down star. But there's always been this connotation of 5s and 6s and 7s and 8s, the 7s being the 7 days of the week, 7 continents, 7. It's all of the incarnations of the goddess in form. It just gets really wild when you start looking at all this stuff in regard to how it inflects upon the building blocks of the reality that we're encased within.
See, and I think all of this is where the secrets to the whole Tesla thing, like if you only knew the secrets of 3, 6, and 9.
3, 6, 9.
Like, I think this plays in with all of this, and it's one of those things that it's like, it's always on the tip of your tongue, and I feel like the occultists, the Freemasons know what he means by that, and that's why, like, all of his information was repressed so much. Like, I feel like there was an honest answer to that, but it's one of those things that it's like, that's part of the hidden knowledge. Like, you're not allowed to know this, so it's never going to be something that you're able to dive into unless you start diving into these secret mysteries.
And back to the mystery schools, hence these individuals, these bourgeoisie, these dukes, these kings, all these different, trying to get into all these different esoteric orders, to learn all these secret mysteries, to try to, like, I don't know, is it, and I think at one point it was the heightening of the individual's mind to take them away from the ideas of fate, so that people started to control their own mortal destinies. But when you get into the later systems, the simulacra that arise, that became the genitalia of government, that you essentially have bastardized those secrets and turned it into an egotistical thing where people are seeking power and connections, and the mysteries kind of fall to the wayside a little more. And then you have the Jesuits, invading the Masons, and the Catholic Church saying no Jesuits or Masons, and the rise of the first third party in America being the anti-Mason party, because people were against these ideas of secrecy. And when you get into some of these oaths, as far as how, basically, they're going to cut your guts out in front of you, cut your tongue out, all these different threats that, are put upon them through their oaths, to keep the secrets. It's, and
they break them down mentally at another point too, because it's like they always seem to have these ideas that within like somewhat of the rituals of joining, like you end up getting naked at one point and everybody's standing around you, and it seems like it's either one somewhat of like a humiliation ritual, or on the other side it's a matter of like breaking you down to the point where you feel like you are like bare in front of these people, so in turn they can build you up from nothing. So it's like symbolic on like two different ways, but also on another side it also kind of seems like, if you're viewing things from like a biblical standpoint, that considering they're in like a totally different lane when this comes to this kind of stuff, it almost kind of makes you wonder if it kind of falls somewhat into the lines of like homosexuality, where they'll try to like get you to unintentionally commit this sin. So then in turn, like you're kind of locked into like this idea of system. Mindset and thinking, and system. So
now if you go back to those Dionysian mystery schools, right? There was, that's where we start to get the rise of these theaters. Coming out of different funerary games, coming out of festival games. So you start to have these performances of these sacred kind of passion plays that kind of happen within these mystery schools, right? And what is it? Herodotus, he wrote this play called the Bacchae, which is considered one of the most important plays of ancient Greece, essentially. And they say that Plato created all the ideas and the universals and put everything into form and structure, and Herodotus kind of took that and broke it down and turned it into this whole dissimulated system as the end of Greece was turning into Rome, essentially. right? But within the Bacchae, that's where you essentially have these. It's about the Dionysian cults coming into Greece, and they're like kind of effeminate men that dance and sing, and basically, this character comes in to this king and, causes all this. It shows the disruption that this philosophy kind of brought into, Greece at the time, and just how it affected the mentalities of the people with this traveling kind of effeminate kind of, but that's the whole thing, going back to that androgyny once again, but then as Dionysus shifts and becomes Bacchus within the Roman culture, right? Now we have to go back and look at Mother Cybele or Cybele or Sybil, right? There was this, do you know about the Sibylline prophecy?
For anybody that may not know, also, might as well just fill them all in.
Fill them all in. Okay, so there was this prophetess that basically, I want to say it was at Pythos, which was named after the python. And basically what they would do is they would set up this golden tripod over this volcanic crack inside of a cave, right? And then the goddess, or not the goddess, but the priestess, the Sibylline prophetess, she would get up on the tripod over this volcanic vent, and inside the volcanic vent, they believed there was a python that was rotting, right? And that the fumes from this rotting python were coming up through the vent and would basically give this prophetess like visions of the future. And it was Pythagoras' parents that basically brought him through Pythos. And they said, she was still pregnant at the time, but they were like, you'll give birth to this character that will be, like a wise, divine individual that will affect and shape the world for all time to come, right? So they named the baby Pythagoras after Pythos, after the python, right? That became the Pythagoras we know of, the singing of the spheres and the Pythagorean theorem and all the various things that, and what was it? Pythagoras had, I read somewhere, something like upwards of a school of 30,000 individuals that all sat in complete silence while they were instructed in the mysteries.
It's kind of another weird thing to think about, that the newest Indiana Jones movie, which was created by Disney, which everybody knows all the connections with that, was all based around Pythagoras and this like weird invention he had where basically it could it was basically like a time machine is the best way to describe it. But it was figured out from geometry, which again kind of plays into all these secret mysteries. Like, is there something to it? And also kind of connecting with what you were saying about, all these demons or like disembodied beings essentially being like frozen within this one area. It makes you wonder if, again, there's like a matter of unlocking that, and you could potentially do it through geometry to figure out how to manipulate time function like that. Like, it's just weird that there's all these weird underlying things where it's almost like they want to kind of subconsciously put the idea in your head, which I'm assuming probably kind of plays into a lot of this theater stuff that, it's not necessarily intended to always put stuff directly in front of you, but rather like, if you were trying to like hide your philosophy within something, you would create this specific scene within like the play that you were doing. And in turn, you're not directly saying your philosophy, but in turn you're making people think of your philosophy. So it's like you're subconsciously programming them, which kind of plays into some stuff later on.
Well, and that's the idea of teaching through subtlety. Like, it's not about what the story's about. It's about who the character is, how he acts, what he likes to smoke, what he likes to drink, the kind of things he's in. It's the subtleties that lie underneath the story that are the actual teachers within theater, right? And that became a major factor as you move through, up into Shakespeare and the Globe Theater, and acts as a kind of propaganda for the people to think. And what was it? Asclepius, not Asclepius. There was a playwright at the end of Greece. I'll think of his name in a minute. But he wrote. It may have been it may have been Euripides again. But he wrote about. There's this one story where he wrote about a traveling group of theater kind of came to town. And they were kind of priest temple builders doing passion plays. And they basically were like, during the play, they told everybody, because the theater itself brings you into a state of, a type of hypnosis, like they talk about with television, how the flicker rate, it influences, you going into a type of mesmer trance because you're so focused on the story, but during this performance, they were like, oh, look, the tower from the castle has fallen. And all the people from that town, they're like, oh, and the king is dead, and like all this stuff, and they're going along with this tower falling. And this fool, like a traveling fool from the tarot, he comes rolling into town, and he's like, and they're like, oh, the king is dead. Can't you see the tower's falling down? And the fool's like, what are you talking about? The tower's right there. So it's like this idea that you can be put into such a trance that you can't even see what reality is, because it's captured your imagination and brought you to the point of believing in the storyline versus what's in reality right before your eyes.
So it's almost like you get into this whole idea about like breaking the third wall and intention, but the intention probably behind breaking the third wall is that you're bringing people back to reality for a second. So then it's a subconscious thing that they then start. They already had this idea, the story in their head, and they may not have connected it into reality. But then if you have somebody break the third wall, then now they're thinking about reality while they have this concept behind them. And then, dude, this gets into this whole theory that I've been talking about for a long time, where when people are talking about like all these occult practices, mind control, all this stuff, I think it's just a master understanding of philosophy and in turn in psychology. So in turn, they're able to completely manipulate how people think. And they think it's this like super magical concept, but it's simply just a matter of thousands and thousands and thousands of years of knowing how to do one little quick thing, and it'll alter in somebody's mind in the back of their head. Like it's not
Human
magic,
psychology.
it's philosophy. It's philosophy and psychology.
Yeah, mixed together. Yeah.
Don't go anywhere, guys. We'll be right back. But just a quick reminder, if you'd like to rock some gear for one of your favorite podcasts, creatures, or topics, hop on over to the Open Minds Media store on Etsy and Printify for a wide range of designs with new drops regularly. The most recent design available is the Squatch Country Fear and Loathing parody design, with Sasquatch as Hunter S. Thompson and Mothman as Dr. Gonzo, with artwork by Chris Holm of the Conspire Theory podcast. Welcome back to the show. Now let's dive right in.
Now when Dionysus becomes Bacchus, right, in the Roman pantheon, right, Bacchus is the god of drunkenness and revelry. They celebrated the Bacchanal in Rome, which basically it was around Christmas time, and what they would do was the masters would actually have to serve the slaves, and the slaves, so they would reverse positions, right? And then eventually down the road, this became the idea of the freed slave. And they would wear the Phrygian hat, back to the Phrygian mysteries. So this is carrying right up into Rome, where they're wearing this Phrygian hat from the Phrygian mysteries, like the Papa Smurf hat, Mm-hmm. And so basically, when Bacchus gets introduced into Rome and gets a temple on the Palatine Hill, which is where all the gods are, right? So back to the Sibylline prophecy, right? They go to the Sibylline prophecy because Hannibal has invaded Italy. And he's been there, and he's using all the resources from the lands for all the troops that he has there. And he's just got all these garrisons of troops set up, and these big elephants that he has to feed. And so they go to the Sibylline prophecy, and they're like, how do we get Hannibal to leave? And the Sibylline prophecy, she sits over the vent, and she's got, it's not acacia. maybe this, but she's got this one kind of plant in one hand, and she's holding the reed in the other hand, and she's breathing these fumes from this volcano. And she basically says, if you want Hannibal to leave, then you have to go to Phrygia and basically bring Mother Kybele or Mother Cybele to Rome and to the Palatine Hill, right? So they go all the way to Phrygia. And even if you look in Virgil's writings, who basically wrote the propaganda that established the heritage of Rome and where it came from, it goes back to the Phrygian mysteries, right? Because Virgil basically ties it in with, because that's the whole thing. It's all related to this ancient sacred mysticism going back to the time before, the flood, and when these 7 sacred sciences were created. And so nonetheless, they go to Phrygia, and the Mother Kybele or Cybele, she's represented by this black stone, right? And it's just this big, getting into modern investment companies and why do they name themselves
Black
these
Rock.
things? Black Rock, it's just interesting to, the dichotomy of it all. But so they get this, and this Black Rock was said to have been this meteor that came crashing down through the atmosphere and was the incarnation of the goddess herself in physical form as this meteorite, right? So they go and they get this black stone and they put it on a wagon, and they have a procession and this train of all these sacred monks that come with Cybele or Kybele. And these are these effeminate, basically they on their high festival day, these worshippers of Mother Kybele or Cybele, they were associated with Attis, and they would demasculate themselves in a frenzy, right? So they basically bring this black stone. They end up putting it on a ship. There's this whole story about how the ship got grounded in the river as they were bringing it up through and into Rome. And some girl got it off the uncaught by something she did with her bosom and her bra, and she hung her bra on it as some sort of blessing. And the ship went, and then they bring this black stone to Palatine Hill, which is where all the Roman gods are, right? In this whole area. And they build her a temple, and they limit these Galli to stay on the Palatine Hill, because it's so obstructed the Roman society to have these men that were dressing as women and basically doing, they had swords and shields, and they were doing almost like war dances, and they would end up cutting themselves, and there would be, blood everywhere. On the festival days, they would try to cover the statue of Mother Cybele completely with blood. And then at the end of the festival, they would march it down to the shore and bathe it, and then take it back up to Palatine Hill. But nonetheless, when the mother got to Palatine Hill, because she was like Isis, the mother of all the gods, basically she became the dominant force in the Roman pantheon, right? Mm-hmm. This black rock, right? So this is the ruling power now over all the other gods of Rome. And they would incorporate the mysteries of Attis through Bacchus, because Bacchus basically, coming around that long way through Greece into Bacchus. And then when Bacchus was under Mother Kybele or Cybele, they reinstituted the rites of Attis that had been practiced in Byblos. by these Gibbelim, right? And that was the whole frenzied castrations on that. They called it the Day of Blood, when the highest initiates would raise themselves to such a frenzy that they would castrate themselves. And then they would run through the city and throw it through a window, and whoever's house it was in, they would have to bring them out a dress and makeup and all the stuff to basically, turn them into an androgynous being, essentially, right? But nonetheless, all of the gods now are under Mother Kybel, right? But then as you go through it, and it was, again, back to these funerary games, back to these festival games that were occurring, and these passion plays that you see the rise of Greek theater coming into Roman theater, coming into the circuses that were, like the bread and circuses that were basically to supplicate the masses so they wouldn't rise up against the state, So through this course of these sacred temple builders, which the Masons associate themselves with, we see the rise of theater, we see the rise of propaganda, we see the rise of supplicating the masses. And then I may have said it before, but the bread, when they would hand out the bread to the Romans, because they would get everybody into the city, and not everybody had a way to take care of themselves. So in order to get to keep the masses from getting too rabbled up and uptight, they would go around and give them bread, and bread kind of makes you a little sleepy, makes you lethargic. But if the people were still getting rowdy and kind of uppity, they would grind up bay leaves and put the bay leaves in the bread. And that would basically make the population sleep for a day or two, because the bay leaves would just put them out.
I've never actually heard that part of that before with the bread. And I'm assuming that kind of diving into like this aspect of it, kind of getting into like the gladiator battles, like considering that they were like these bloody, horrific battles, assumably that was some type of like ritual then, if you're kind of viewing it from this point. It wasn't just the simple keep the masses entertained so that they don't revolt. It's also two birds, one stone. It's a ritual. Yeah. And same with a lot of these like plays, a lot of concerts people go to, a lot of movies and stuff. It's like, if you conduct a ritual but make it seem like it's entertainment, then you have people that are becoming part of the ritual without realizing that they're part of the ritual.
That they're being initiated.
Exactly.
Yeah. So even from this time, we see that, right up into the various Super Bowl performances now, the superb owl. It's, but it's.
There's a joke of, have you ever heard of the show, What We Do in the Shadows?
No.
Oh man, there's an episode of that where they have all this like weird underlaying of it, because obviously they're supposed to be vampires that have been around forever, and it's like a mockumentary style. But there's an episode where one of the guys says, "Oh, I'm having a Super Bowl party," and they all think they said the superb owl party or something like that. Yeah. So like the whole time they're like getting ready to like go and worship the superb owl and all this stuff. So it's like even within popular media that's on FX, it's like you have these things that, somebody just hears it, you're not going to think twice about it. But then when you actually start digging into the occult stuff, you're like, okay, why did they place that there? Like, is it to subconsciously put this in people's minds so that they're associating the two together? But at the same time, though, they're, they hear Super Bowl more. So it's like there's a superb owl, but subconsciously they're just going to hear Super Bowl now. So it's almost like they're tricking people away from the root word to think about the word that they want you to think about instead.
Right. A derelict of dialect.
But it's also a matter of being aware too, because that seems to be a principle in all this like occult stuff. So like, people are watching the Super Bowl, but they're not fully aware. Maybe it's this thing where you have to make some people again subconsciously aware. So if you put stuff in media like again superb owl, now people are subconsciously aware. So now they're even more so part of the ritual with again not necessarily knowing it fully.
Well, and I've said over and over in a lot of my, shows I do that I think we're in a age of ritual initiation, where basically the ideas of MK Ultra have gone underground, and essentially they're introducing these substances through television shows and using the various, performances for ritual cult initiation rituals. And I think that's pretty obvious to a lot of people now.
I mean, even just normalizing concepts like I think I've said this on a few times now, but like Squid Game is like a prime example. It's like this huge hit when it's like actually this like gruesome, bloody, like awful concept, but they do this thing where it's a subconscious thing again, where if you watch a show, you put yourself in the position of those characters and you do this, like, what would I do if I was in that situation? Yeah. And no matter who you are, like, you end up doing this, like, subconsciously. So you end up, like, normalizing these concepts. So in turn, when all of a sudden they present themselves in front of you, you know, they're not going to seem as ridiculous. And it seems like we've had this idea of, one, the Gladiator game, where the Gladiator games were the original one. And then you have, like, the idea that they were saying with, like, Squid Game. You have, like, the Running Man going back to, like, the 80s and stuff, 80s, where they've always had this thing where like they want to keep it in the minds of everybody, this whole idea about like blood sport, but it's a matter of like waiting until they can get to a point where they can do it again. But it's like they've pushed so far away from it, they have to renormalize it so that they can start doing stuff like this again. Right.
But it's also a simulacra of blood sport. There's, if you read Aldous Huxley's Moksha book, I want to say it's page 11 or page 13. He talks about the idea that they're going to have to figure out a way to find a substance that does the same thing as drinking ritual blood. And it goes into adrenochrome. And there's this whole idea of adrenochrome studies. And one of the guys he's working with, they were worried that if you were on adrenochrome and you were introduced with a fear state, that you could go into a fear hole where you kept going deeper and deeper into fear and you could never get out. But there's a whole series of adrenochrome experiments that you can read. It's all, you know, declassified stuff. You can read it. But Humphrey Osmond, I think, was the doctor that was doing that. But at the same time, you know, you go back to the blood ritual of Rome, and now we have the simulacra, or the simulated blood ritual. And, you know, what was it in court cases? They made it illegal to have, like, to do a film set and show you the accident, because once they showed you the accident, in all the jurors' mind, the accident had happened. So it's the idea that whether you're watching the real thing in the gladiatorial games or whether you're watching the simulacra on the television set, and what do they say? Children see 10,000 murders by the time they're like, you know, 8 or 9 years old, you know, so it desensitizes the individual through the course of their life. I'm pretty desensitized, I have to say. I grew up on television. But at the same time, you're still getting the same inherent inner response. I know when I'm watching shows and something super violent, because we're watching Primeval right now about early America and the Mormon and Indian war, Native American wars. And, you know, they just blast somebody like point blank to the face. And I'm like, oh, you know, so I'm still getting those inherent reactions like I'm at the you know, circus games of Hippo. You know, we're still getting those bursts of adrenaline and those, you know, and then you get into the ideas of trauma-based mind control and what theater does and the mesmer state, and start looking at all these various things. And, you know, but so back to Mother Kybell, because now she's the mother of all the gods, they incorporate all of the different worship of all the gods under her, and they try to keep these Galli or these Gallus, these dancing kind of troupe of androgynous, you know, people on Palatine Hill for the first couple of years. But then it ends up going into the city, and then you end up finding it, you know, as far as away as in the Slavian country. It just proliferates through all of Rome, you know.
Seems like we're getting there with media and entertainment now, that it was like we had the masculine, we had the feminine, but now we're getting to this point where it's almost like those ages again, where it's all starting to like blend, where like you know, all this weird stuff's coming out about these rappers that you looked at as masculine, and all of these like feminine people are starting to come out as, you know, trans or whatever, or they're starting to like act more of like the masculine role of things. So it's like history repeats itself. It seems like you had the definition of the two, but then you get to a point where you start blending it, and maybe that's to create chaos where people don't necessarily know their place in society anymore, but it seems like it's reoccurring again. Nietzsche,
in his treatise on what was it, democracy. He talks about the idea that within democracy, because everyone becomes equal, everyone wants to be like everyone else, therefore the men start to become like the women become like the men. There is an inherent philosophy that you can trace back with all of these concepts, but the thing was, so as it went on, they would start, this is later in the 80 time now, after Dominus, versus BC was a lot of this. 200-300 BC was when she came in, but then later on, as it became more normalized, they tried to do away with the castrations. So what they did was, within the cult of Attis, they had what they called the cryoblarium, where they would build like a grate, and then they would bring in a ram. And instead of castrating yourself, you would basically go under this ram, and they would do the ritual, and then they would sacrifice the ram, and then you would be washed in the blood. This is where the terminology comes later in Christianity, where you're washed in the blood of this of the ram, of the lamb. But then, so that was within the Attis cult on the hill, Palatine Hill there in Rome, right? But within the goddess cult of Mother Kybele, they had what they called the Toro Oblarium, where they would basically get a bull and do the very same thing. But it was for the higher class of Rome, the plutocracy, and they would basically pay for the animal and the whole ceremony. And they would do this like every 20 years. And it was the whole idea of being reborn again within the mysteries. So that's, where you get this whole kind of rising idea of being reborn coming out of these ancient end of the, and then as things went on, the Senate stopped funding the various cults on Palatine Hill with the rise of Christ coming in. And, so then now with Kybele or Cybele and Attis, right? Mother Kybele, she ends up claiming her place on Mount Olympus with the other gods in the Roman pantheon, right? And when she does that, she takes Attis, who is a mortal human, and brings him with her into. So here we have the idea of like Enoch is translated into the heavens. Attis is the earliest example I can find of an apotheosis of an individual, where the god forms basically take a mortal human and bring them into the heavens, which we see the apotheosis with various kings and queens. We see it with there's an apotheosis of Napoleon, and we also see the apotheosis of George Washington in the Capitoline Dome in Washington, D.C. So this is a philosophy that is carried right up until, but then, and with Jesus, you have this rising idea of transubstantiation, which kind of is coming in and wanting to, through the Holy Roman Church, kind of putting down these ancient cults of Dionysus and Bacchus and Cybele, and kind of bringing in this new philosophy of, the Christos, the Christ child, and transubstantiation.
Hold that thought. We'll be right back. But before we get into this break, if you might be interested in joining a growing community of like-minded individuals, then pop on over to the Open Minds Media Telegram, a place to discuss high strangeness, conspiracies, and anything else on your mind. Bizarre and open-minded individuals always welcome. Link to join available down in the show description. And we are back, so let's get back to it. Let's say one comment I did want to make when you brought up Aldous Huxley, kind of connecting in with some of the mind control and stuff you were talking about, trying to like instill these ideas, and kind of even what I was saying earlier about this like master understanding of like psychology linked in with all this occult understanding. For anybody that's read Brave New World, which also kind of weird that seems to be one of those books they want you to read in school, so it's still like subconsciously in your mind. They basically the entire first like quarter of the book is basically talking about how they're able to manipulate people's minds into like specifically knowing their place in society, which again, knowing that he was in eugenics and everything like that, you know, it's a totally different view on that. And then getting this idea, what you were talking about with basically needing this like psychedelic substance in order to get people like fully involved in these rituals, you know, the whole idea of like soma and the idea that there was like the ritual that would make everybody feel like they were at peace with each other, and Bernard didn't want to be part of it and everything, but he was still forced to take the soma and be part of all this stuff. And then even connecting even farther in with like the nuclear family concept, that they're the savages and, you know, society is what we need it to be, and everybody has their specific role, and death isn't something to be scared of. We don't want anybody to be scared of death. We want them to get to a point where they realize that with death, the new thing can usher in so society can continue on. It's like, it's weird. They program and predict and put this stuff in your head as a kid, and then when you start actually looking at it when you get older and start connecting it in with things, like you realize, like, I don't know, I feel like Aldous Huxley was extremely close on this stuff, and I don't think it's a matter of like him trying to release the information, anything like that. He was fully involved in this stuff, and it's weird, like specifically that book, for all of these like dystopian society books, it seems like we're the closest by far to that one, because, you know, we're starting to legalize cannabis, they're starting to decriminalize mushrooms. And if you control that, you can totally bring on a whole different view of that stuff. And you start creating this synthetic variation of it, which they seem to be starting to kind of push towards trying to do. And then it connects in with this whole idea of like, you know, the nuclear family is the savages, you know, you need to use birth control, and then you guys can be one with everybody and get with whoever you want to get with. Like, we're so close to that. And I think that it's mainly because of this whole idea that they've subconsciously programmed that into people's minds, where without even realizing it, they've pushed towards this society. And that's again why it's mandatory reading. But again, connecting with this whole like occult philosophy, it's all just psychology and an understanding of psychology. And they'll even tell you it directly out how they do it.
Out, flat out. Well, and he even says that this is a warning, that this is what they're planning, that this is the playbook. You know, and he says, you know, it's up to you to make sure this doesn't happen. You know, so he was in some ways acting as a potential white hat, you know, amongst the Illuminists per se, you know.
Say, it makes you wonder though if even that is intentional, because like if you're the guy who's part of the group who says, I want to tell you these secrets so this doesn't happen to you, it's like you're going to take it more seriously, but you're not going to look at that guy as the bad guy, but in turn you're going to take in the information even more and then stick it somewhere in the file compartment in the back of your head, then all of a sudden it'll pop up. But people don't realize stuff until they're already in it. So it's like the one day that it's actually happening, you're actually in it. One day somebody's going to look around, like I've kind of weirdly been doing recently, and go, wow, we're like 2 steps away from exactly this society.
Oh yeah. You know, and with what's going on with Trump and the ideas of the CBDCs and, you know, it's just interesting how the rhetoric of Elon Musk is the exact same rhetoric of Klaus Schwab, you know, and they're all working to roll in this, you know, digital ID system for people moving in and out, that, you know, they're trying to tie into the social credit score. It's very technocratic, panopticon, very 1984 New World, you know, Brave New World type of stuff going on that we're living in, you know.
It's either one, you get the thought police, or on the other side, you get connected in with this virtual reality concept and technical or technology tracking you. So it's like, you know, it's always a lesser of both evils, but it depends on which one you kind of think is the lesser of both evils. But I mean, even moving in this agenda, it's like the whole connection with all of the tech stuff with like Trump didn't really like come in until after he was already somewhat like established that he was going to be the next one in charge. So it's like, you know, they still didn't fully give you the playbook until it was already too late. And now it's not like you can go back from this concept, but a lot of the people that were pro-Trump were like anti like AI, like tech future stuff. But now it's like they've subconsciously tricked them that, you know, if you're a Trump guy, you also got to be an Elon Musk guy. And they make it so those two are inseparable. So now you have this idea of like the only way we're going to push forward with the future is through technology. And in turn, it's like, they talk about freedom, like we're going to have this, we're going to have that, but it's all about just different methods of tracking and
tracing and
getting back into this concept that they've tricked society into doing these things themselves. Like even when you were talking about earlier with the whole idea that they would like remove their manhood and stuff like that, like, people didn't want to do that ritual anymore, but now we moved into this spot in society where like, if all of these occult principles are really underlying a lot of society, then a lot of these people that are getting these surgeries may also be part of, an occult ritual without necessarily realizing that they're part of an occult ritual because they've manipulated the subconscious of people that they don't realize that within everybody there's duality. There's like masculine energy and there's feminine energy. And instead they've demonized the whole concept of masculine energy. So people focus on their feminine energy, and then in turn they get more comfortable with that. And then they end up conducting this ritual without even necessarily realizing it.
Well, and also there are some white papers from the UN in 1951 and 1952 where they openly talk about putting gender bending chemicals in the water to basically create, medical revenue generation, so it's these things, these types of weapons, getting into all the various things that the various, governments do behind the scenes. It's some scary stuff going on, from transhumanism to the mRNA stuff to, trauma-based mind control through media. It's quite the interesting world we're stuck in.
See, and it makes you wonder which one we're pushing more towards. Again, it's like Brave New World or 1984, because Brave New World has this whole concept where there's not really war or anything like that, and everybody's just in this like, philosophical almost type of society. But on the other side, in 1984, they talk about like the philosophy of war, and the whole concept is that if you're always at war, people are always willing to give that little extra and take some cutbacks in order to help the war effort. And no matter what, you always have to remain at war, because then in turn, people aren't expecting to be able to get ahead. It's mainly they'll get them into this concept of just maintaining, because they want to put everything they can towards the war effort, because this fear, this other society coming in and destroying your society is existing just outside your doorstep. So you got to fight that off at all times. So you're willing to give more for that to not happen.
And that gets into the whole idea of war is peace, this inversion philosophy. And when you look at 1984, where they're actually from a fundamental, a zygote level, taking the genetics, and, if they're going to work in a certain environment, then they basically incorporate that environment into the zygote as it develops into the fetus, whereas when you look at, what was it? The other book we were talking about there, 1984 versus Brave New World. Brave New World, they're basically in a more primitive state, very much kind of like King Kesey talks about One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and how we basically have to break out of the asylum and go back to nature and live in the woods, and basically this idea of this primitive state of man. And they go into all the Native American stuff and the ghost dances. But when you get to the guy that is basically running everything, he's got all the sacred information, all of the stuff that they don't want humans to see, like locked away for his own privy to enjoy, while,
And he has the split too, where basically they gave him the option. They basically said, you're becoming aware. So again, this kind of falls into the occult practice of stuff, where they basically say, because you've become aware, your choices are, you can either go to this island, as they say, which you never really know where that island is, because the other two characters in Brave New World just kind of disappear after that point, and then it focuses on John. But, he says that was my option, or I could be one of the people that's smart enough and understands philosophy where I can control the ideas of society. So it's like, would I rather be here and have all my books and be able to manipulate society, or go to this island and study the sciences? And I mean, that seems like that could also kind of play into some stuff, because when you start digging into like all of these scientists and everything that are like really far down the rabbit hole and discovering all this technology, they're all in these like underground hidden bases. Like they're trying to keep them away from the rest of society, while you have these figureheads that are in the front that understand the philosophy, and then they're playing dumb to get you to follow their philosophy, which they have more of an understanding of than you do.
But that in itself is the initiation into the mystery school, into a higher form of thinking, into a higher form of understanding, into the enlightenment, or the idea of Lucifer being the teacher, the idea of the Illuminati, the idea of these various secret mystery schools that hold this sacred information, that separates the Freemason from the average individual,
See, and that makes you wonder if, like, in school, for example, the reason why you study like geometry, for example, is like, not because everybody always says like you never end up like really using this stuff after you leave school unless you're like an engineer or certain specific sets of jobs, but it almost makes you wonder if, knowing that the school system was set up by these elite type of individuals, if they like will purposely put this in there, and if there's somebody that like really shines or really gets ahead of it, the topic, that they'll come in and be like, hey, you want to learn some more stuff?
Special program.
Yeah, you're going into a special program, but everybody else, they're like, all right, we ain't got to worry about this guy because he's got a C. We ain't got to worry about this guy because he's got a D. They're not going to figure it out. So it's almost like an intentional test to see if you have what it takes or you don't. And even on the weird side of that, I had, I don't know if you've ever met him, Ron Weed from Imaginarium of Thought. He's had this whole thing with this connection with like numerology, and he basically was shown this like math or this equation at one point, and he started like expanding on it, and he said that it basically started in his like geometry class where he had another kid that was like, oh, you want to like learn some secrets? He's like, my family's part of something, and we could have more stuff to show you with this. So even within the students in the class, it makes you wonder if they have these ploys where it's like a subconscious way to bring them in. You can't just have the teacher or some random person show up to that kid and be like, hey, you have some other kid that lures them in, makes them comfortable, and then once you get him involved in this shit, then it's a point where it's like there's no going back.
So there is some talk about Philip K. Dick being basically pulled out and put in some sort of an MK Ultra program. But then when you get up to Ted Kaczynski, and then pulling him, and basically he's genius level, and he goes through MK Ultra, and then what became of him, versus Manson. When he was in Vacaville, he went through MK Ultra, and then he gets out and is basically doing a similar type Epstein deal in Hollywood. It's very interesting when you start to overlap the machinations of the mystery schools with intelligence and modern day mind control operations.
Well, let me ask you this one then, because I'm sure that you probably have some thoughts on this, and I've definitely had some thoughts on this, and I see stuff starting to pop out about it a little bit. But the whole like LA fires, the Hollywood sign burning, and considering
that was AI.
Oh, that was AI. So that was never actually
never happened.
So there's another some manipulated information, because how many different pictures are there of this Hollywood sign burning all over the internet, where the majority of people believe that it is burning,
and people were celebrating this.
That's that's what I'm saying, where it gets into like the occult stuff. Like what's kind of your views on like the fires? Like, do you think it's part of a ritual? Do you think it's part of like an intentional thing, or do you think it was honestly just a complete accident that happened? Because there's a lot of mixed reviews and ideas on it, and I think it's one of those things that we'll never get to the bottom of, because they're going to just muddy the waters as much as possible.
There's been a long-term idea going back, even before Machiavelli, of basically running systems through incompetence, that you put, incompetent people in positions for systems to fail. But it's just, when you get into all the coincidences of, the maintenance on the water reservoir, and they emptied it out, and they haven't been saving previous year's water. It's illegal, for them to store water off their roofs. Like a lot, just there could be things that could alleviate some of this stuff. But, even going back 10 years, there were people that saying, if something happened, because of the way that it's all set up, that, it's just a tinderbox. So, and even to the point that, insurance companies, they basically said they weren't going to cover claims 3 months before, because of the standards that California had put in place that caused the insurance companies to withdraw. I mean, there's a lot of inner working systems, but at a certain point, you got to say, how many coincidences is too many coincidences?
Hold on tight, guys. We're going to take a quick commercial break, but feel free to fast forward through these commercials so we can get back into the show. And now back to the show. Because, I mean, it seems like there's always this reoccurring factor of these, like, big philosophical hubs burning down and rebuilding. Like, I mean, even going back to Rome, how many times was Rome burnt down and they would dance around it? Like, what was his name? Nero, that was the one that danced around it with the fiddle after he set the...
Well, he was just crazy, man.
But that's what I'm saying, man. It's like, it seems like it's almost part of like a ritual that in order to like rebuild infrastructure, you have to completely destroy it. And in turn, by doing that, you can also kind of like, what's the word I'm looking for? Like push out like the certain class systems, like you can.
Well, it's the phoenix rising from the fire.
Yes, that
the
too.
The idea of, within all cycles at a certain point, it all has to burn down for the possibility of, and that goes back into the feminine kind of moon energy of the idea of, breaking down for the purpose of revivifying. And they say, plants during the day, back to the sun and the moon, the plants during the day, they receive all that energy from the sun because it's just giving it out, right? And at night, when it's in that still time, when, basically that's when the plants actually grow, is during the dark time. So, even within the natural cycle of alchemy, you have to burn it all down to that negrito, that black prima materia, in order to be able to facilitate, making the white stone and making the red stone. So it's these fundamental natural processes that everything has to go through. But yeah, I'm not going to jump in and say that it was all intentional. But I think there is a lot of ideas behind planned, just people not be planned obsolescence, where people are in certain positions that are incompetent, and you see that over and over and over again in the bureaucracy.
I mean, no matter what way you look at it, I definitely think that there is, whether or not it was intentionally placed that way or not, I think that there's definitely symbology and like occult practice behind it. And whether or not it's like them taking advantage of an opportunity because it was already on fire, or if it's a matter of they had something to do with it in the first place, there's too much weirdness around it for it to not be something. And especially considering just like the people that live in the area that are like, Hollywood. I mean, like there's just too much with it,
How many people did we see going around that, with various whatever nation status, that were caught basically starting these blazes in various places, from the girl walking by and lighting the trash bag on fire, to the guy with the, accelerant, and, homeless people standing around big fires, people on the side of the freeway. You got the one video of the kid, getting the gas out of the back and adding fuel to the fire. It's just like, that's the whole thing. In states of chaos, when things start to become chaotic, people act very erratically. So you never know, kind of,
kind of seems like it goes back to that occult thing that you were saying with like the rituals where they would do the things with the knives and they'd end up cutting themselves and basically going completely crazy,
getting into a frenzy.
Yeah, getting into a frenzy and literally burning down your own home because you're in such this frenzied state.
Well, and what was that, going back to Addis, he was in a frenzy because he couldn't marry Cybele. Dionysus, he would drive the maenads into frenzy to the point that they would eat people and animals whole in an orgiastic frenzy. Going into Bacchus, the goddess of drunkenness and revelry. And again, back to Plato and the idea of divine state. The divine state is madness, and you kind of look at what the theater did within Euripides, getting the crowd into that state of frenzy, where the maenads ate the king. So you always have these ideas of frenzy and orgy or some sort of a control, like a state that's out of control, associated with these maddened states of these ancient mystery schools as well.
I mean, it sounds just like the whole Bohemian Grove thing, where I'm sure you've dived into it a little bit, because I brought it up when Orin and I did an episode on Bohemian Grove, and he said he didn't really find too much information on it. But the whole concept where they wear like the Minotaur suit or like the ram's head, and they basically will go into this like frenzied state where they'll just do whatever primal urges they have, meaning like if there's somebody in front of them that they want to sexually assault, they'll sexually assault them. If they want to like cut them, they're just going to cut them up. Like they're just going to go into this complete frenzied state. And even kind of diving back into a weird way with like ancient practices possibly going back way farther than what like we think they have. You have stuff like the Pueblo clowns, for example, and the whole principle of that was they would basically just go crazy and they would throw their feces everywhere. They would, masturbate in public, like whatever, like these frenzied states, whatever the ideas behind them, like it seems like it goes back way, way, way further. And I mean, even within like the Egyptian stuff, I mean, I don't know how much validity there actually is to it, but I've seen some weird articles talking about like, Egyptian architecture that's been, found in like the Grand Canyon and, all of these areas that ironically are also the same areas where like the Pueblo clown phenomena would have been happening at. Maybe it connects back in with Egypt and it kind of just brought back into the Americas, or again, it's something that's even older than Egypt or the Americas, and it all just kind of got brought into all of them a little bit.
I think it's way older. I think it goes back pre-Diluvian, back to those back to those fallen ones, and their bastardization of all the birds of the air and the fish of the sea, and teaching the mysteries to humans and having children with earth women, and basically the idea was they wanted to curse the human race. And some of the texts even say they wanted to stop the souls from falling into matter. They wanted to because it was considered as like dirty, the higher divine realm frequency, you're vibrating in a super pure state where you're etheric energy. And then when you fall into matter, you have to take on a physical form, that is finite, that has death associated with it. It's the cosmic riddle since all time began, man.
It literally sounds like Icarus. It's like the same concept, he flew too close to the sun. And, in turn he ended up, getting casted down essentially.
Yeah. Well, and same thing with Nimrod. Building the tower up, trying to get into that doorway into heaven to have access to the tree of life, so that those Nephilim and their offspring could live forever. So they didn't have to die and turn into demonic form. And as they were going up, and the Elohim saw what they were doing, they were like, "Oh no!" And they basically, the lightning strike on the tower card in the tarot, the hand of God basically coming down and crushing this, and that's Timothy Leary has a book called Storming the Heavens, which directly relates to the idea of Nimrod trying to build the tower to get into heaven. Timothy Leary was talking about the same exact thing and using LSD in that way to basically storm the heavens, to recreate reality in our own vision, So, yeah.
That's one weird thing to think about, though, is the whole idea that information, knowledge, isn't necessarily inherently good or evil, but it's rather a matter of the time when mankind possibly was supposed to receive that information. Like, within geometry, you can build a Tower of Babel, or on the other side, you could build a complete, beautiful architectural piece of work that is completely for God himself. Like within every single bit of knowledge, there's duality. It's kind of like magic, it's not necessarily inherently good or evil. It's rather the intention of the user, but it's one of those weird things that it's like, you can't necessarily give everybody the knowledge at any specific time. It's rather like you have to wait until they reach a level of spiritual or like emotional maturity before they can receive this information and not use it in the way that it's not intended to. Or even like astrology, you know, like you had like the three wise men, you know, that would have followed the stars to find Jesus. But on the other side, you know, you have people that'll use astrology to try to guess the future and do all of this. It's like, it's not necessarily inherently good or bad. It's just the practice on how you tend to use it and when you're supposed to have this information. But, you know, if the fallen angels come down and they unleash it all, it's like almost like, you know, you take a piece of technology from today and then you give it to somebody, you know, who lived like a couple thousand years ago. It's not that they shouldn't have that piece of technology necessarily, but it's just that they don't have it at the right time. And who knows what kind of chaos they could conduct with that, not having it at the correct time.
Well, and it's like Solomon, you know, they built that temple to Yahweh, their one, you know, the one true God. And essentially, as things went along and he got more involved in business practices and trading, taking on all these, what did he have? 300 wives and 700 concubines, you know, and he started building other temples to other gods for his wives. And he had built a temple to Moloch on the hill where Jesus, the Mount of Olives speech there, that where Jesus was, there used to be a temple to Moloch there that Solomon had built. And it was said that Solomon had some locusts, I think 3 locusts in his hand, and he crushed them for the god Moloch because his wife told him to. And basically at that point, you know, the wisdom of the true God got cut off. And he like you were saying, so it's the intention of the purpose, of the function, of the spiral, moving upward, moving downward, and how all that interplay happens, you know?
See, I'm glad that you brought up the lotus, because I know with Egyptians, they had, what was it, the purple lotus, or was it a blue lotus?
These were locusts.
Oh, locusts. I thought you said lotus.
Yeah.
Because I was going to say, when you brought up the blue honey, I was curious if the whole like blue lotus thing from Egyptian culture played a part in this blue honey, maybe the bees themselves would, you know, pollinate that specific plant, and in turn they would take certain chemicals from it and end up creating this honey,
make a hallucinogenic honey. But that's so those gibbum, those fine finish masons that we talked about in the beginning, when they were carving the finished work on Solomon's temple, they were actually they carved the blue lotuses at the top of the pillars, you know. So there was definitely a knowledge of these plants as being some sort of a sacred, you know. And you know, I have known friends that have had blue lotus and used it in profuse sweating, heightened states, very much kind of a stimulant, but hallucinogenic at the same time. So yeah, it's you know, but that's the whole thing. You know, you get into the old temple documents and you get into the oil, the cannabosum oil with cannabis, and the various frankincense and myrrh that they would rub on their body before they went into the temple. And then there's temple records that they were burning like 3 full bales of cannabis at every service, you know. So it's just interesting to think how much a part these things, like we were talking about the soma and the cannabis and the psilocybin and all these things that are being, you know, allowed now.
So, you know, and then the other flip side of it that I found was really, really fascinating the other day, I had Nathan Reynolds on, and he grew up in, for lack of a better term, like an occult family, and they would do all of these different rituals with him, and they got him to the point where he eventually ended up becoming like a silent killer and everything like that. He said that they would give him all these different drugs, they get him in these different states of mind, all of this stuff, but the one that they would avoid for whatever reason when they were doing this mind control programming was cannabis. He said that they completely like demonized that, where like they said, you don't touch that stuff, you don't have anything to do with it, but in turn they're doing all of these other drugs. So it's like, it seems like on the other side, there is something specifically spiritual about cannabis itself, also playing into like the light side of things, and having the cannabis receptors in your mind kind of shows that it seems like it's more on that realm, which is probably why they try to keep you away from it. But in turn, that might be the exact reason why that's the first one slowly becoming legalized, is because they want to find a way to manipulate it into something that it's not anymore. Because once the human eugenics concept of gene altering, everything comes in, like that's what's happening to cannabis. So it's not what it was when they were talking about it back then in the Bible. It's this totally different thing now that's been completely altered by human and by man at this point.
Well, when you get into the hybridization of the plant itself, I've heard that there was cannabis from Egyptian pharaohs' tombs that has a higher THC ratio than what we have now. So, when you get into these various, plants and their uses, what was it? The MK Ultra victim that ended up in congressional hearings, Kathy, I can't remember her last name, but she's on Twitter. But she's openly said that cannabis is the one thing that breaks down the mind control.
See, and on the other weird aspect of it, man, like working in the cannabis industry, like I've seen not just from like one specific company, but like as a whole, like the it's degrading. Like it's the same thing that I keep saying, like happened with like tobacco, that it was this very, very different spiritual plant. But then once all of these people got involved with it, view it from capitalism or like occult practice, like they've taken away the spirituality out of the plant itself. And I mean, even getting into like, all these different extracts and like waxes and all that kind of stuff that people are doing now. Yeah. It takes out the physical plant matter, which I feel is part of the spiritual factor of it, is that you need the physical plant itself. So now when you've isolated something out of it and you're, as a human, altering the thing itself, it's almost like you're still getting the high from it, but you're taking away the spiritual part of it. You're taking away like the consciousness of the plant away from it, and you're separating people from it. So then people are going to have this idea that like this is cannabis, kind of like everybody thinks they know what tobacco is, but the tobacco that the natives had was totally different than the tobacco we have now. But after a couple generations, they won't know what cannabis was. They'll just know what they know of it now, and they'll have this complete separation where essentially they close the door on that, and they don't have to worry about anybody undoing the programming through cannabis.
Well, and with cannabis, what was it down in Paraguay? You had Soros and like some of the different cigarette companies basically working to try to make synthetic forms of TA. That's one of the things. They can't make synthetic cannabinol. They can't synthesize it into a synthetic. And they've tried.
So at that point, you just alter it as much as possible, so it takes it away if you can't synthesize it. But
they were trying to make cigarettes down in South, and this is when they had it. It was $1 a gram or something, super cheap. Bunch of people were flying to Paraguay because it was so cheap. But they were trying to engineer cigarettes that basically had super minute amounts of THC and CBD, so that you could smoke them like cigarettes and not get too high but maintain a certain high. So they're trying to basically commercialize a product that I think humans have essentially lived with, worked with, and used for tens of thousands of years.
I mean, even on the other side too, when you start getting into the whole like pharmaceutical aspect of it too, and there's definitely a lot of occult ties within the pharmaceutical practice of it. But if you have this thing that's naturally here that doesn't require altering to get rid of like all of these like crazy diseases within humans, then you got to get rid of that. You got to manipulate it so that it takes it away from that. And I feel like it's just a matter of time where everybody wants to see like federally legal cannabis, but on the other side, it's like companies like Philip Morris are going to get involved at that point. They're going to start adding even more of these preservatives to it and all this stuff. And eventually you'll get to a point where they start preserving, packs of joints with like formaldehyde, just like they do cigarettes. And then you'll start seeing cancer warnings on cigarettes when, the whole, it's supposed to completely help with the opposite, like.
Right. Well, what is it? They put something like 280 different chemicals within the cigarettes, so that you're freebasing the nicotine, addictive factors, like all these different. Like,
they even add fiberglass filters so that you'll get little barbs stuck in your lungs and it'll build up and it'll get you addicted faster.
Right. And then you get into menthol cigarettes, and that's a whole nother level. It's It's definitely interesting. And then what was it? The whole story how the cigarette scientists that had engineered the cigarettes when the Joe Camel thing happened, and basically all the cigarette companies went to Indonesia where there's no laws and addicted all the young kids. All those nicotine scientists, all those cigarette scientists went into the food industry and then made the food super addictive and super bad for us. It's who knows if it's mythos or if it's real, but it seems like it's feasible.
Hold on tight, guys. We'll be back with that bizarre stuff you crave. And we are back with the high strangeness. Let's get back into it. You take everything that's natural and you manipulate it to a point where it's unrecognizable, and then a generation or two down the line, they don't even know what the original was. And you don't even know the difference anymore.
And that's the whole, have you read Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood Inn?
I don't think I have, actually.
Oh, I highly recommend that book, because that's the whole idea of normalization. That's what the book's about, and these entities come in UFOs and they sit over the cities for like 20 years, before they finally introduce the aliens to the people. And it's this gradual process of indoctrination of the masses so nobody freaks out. They do it intergenerationally over time. Yeah, that's a great book. Read A Childhood's End by Arthur C. Clarke.
I'm going to look that up. I'm going to make sure I write that one down. Dude, this is one thing I've been wanting to talk about for a while, is like being on the inside of the cannabis industry, like the whole other side of it that I don't think people necessarily realize, that everybody's just like, oh, we're getting more potent product. But all the smokers that have run around for a while, and I'm sure you've experienced the same thing, it's like the high is completely different. It's like the plant has lost its like will, or like lost its like consciousness or something. Yeah. It's like all these numbers are testing higher than they supposedly have ever tested before. But I feel like I don't get the same reaction. It's like, I'm sure you could probably get into this one a bit, but it seems like a lot of the time people are experiencing more laziness now off the weed than anything, where a lot of the time in the past, like people use it as like a creative muse, like it would inspire them to do this, it would inspire them to do that. And even a couple of years ago, dude, like when I started my podcast, like I'd be able to like smoke while I was editing and I'd be like awake, alert, like doing my thing. And now it's gotten to a point where it's like I smoke and it's the middle of the day and I'm wide awake and it's like all I want to do is sleep. So two birds, one stone. You also make another way to make the society more docile, because everybody's becoming aware of the fluoride. So now you got to move it to another means, and you normalize cannabis, where, even like the dad that was like completely against cannabis like 5 years ago is now asking his son, hey, can I get a little bit of weed from you? So it's like you're normalizing it all across the board. So everybody's just calm and docile and doesn't want to get involved in anything. And then they can't think about philosophy on it because they're too tired now.
Yeah. Well, and it's like when you go back and look at Maria Sabina, when who was it? One of the Luce brothers that founded Time Magazine. It's actually the receipts for the trip were in the MK Ultra receipts that were left over. But when they went down and basically got the psilocybin mushrooms, the psilocybe, to basically try to extract it and turn it into something similar to like when they were doing LSD research and experimentation. And Maria Sabina said that basically, the sacred like aspect of it, the energy force that was the healing aspect, and it had left the plant, because it had they had basically taken it and tried to manipulate it and commercialize it.
And that's exactly word for word how I feel about cannabis, working in it for the past like 8 years. I saw the plants when we first started, like everything was just bright, happy, like the plants seem happy. And it sounds weird for people that don't get into like the spiritual aspect of things, but like, when I was working in the rooms and everything, it just felt like the plants themselves had like a totally different energy. And now it's kind of like, feels like that corporatized like doom and gloom. And it's like even new people kind of coming in, it's like people just don't seem as like energetic about it anymore. And it's not, I don't think necessarily that it's just been around forever, but rather that like the energy that you were getting from these plants naturally, just being around them, is starting to deplete, because they're like losing their consciousness. They're losing like the spiritual aspect of these things. Yeah.
Is it because at one point it was a taboo and it was thought about a certain way, so it was more exciting and the highs were higher, versus now it's just normalized? You can go into any corner store and get whatever you want, and it doesn't have the mystique that it once used to have. Now it's turned into factory farm, like food almost, where, in a lot of cases, it's a race to the bottom. The tests are obfuscated. Funguses and various, things end up in there that shouldn't in some cases. I mean, it's become an industry.
I mean, even on another weird way to think about it, so everybody knows like the whole idea with like sulfur and like what sulfur represents and everything. And it's like, that's one of the main things that you end up spraying on plants as like an insecticide is like sulfur. Right. So it's like getting into the more occult ideas of things. If you're taking this plant that's supposed to be like something that was like God's gift to man, and that's why he again put cannabis receptors in people's brains, because it's something we're intended to have, and then now you're coating this thing in sulfur all the time. Like what is that doing?
Even in the Garden of Eden, there was a section of the Garden of Eden called the Garden of Kush.
Yeah, exactly. That's because, like I said, it's there. If there is something on this planet that essentially doesn't have to have anything chemically done to it, you can basically just grow it, cut it, dry it, and it already has the healing factors. Like that just shows that it's something that's intended to be used directly, and it doesn't seem like it's fallen angel knowledge, where like DMT, for example, or like ayahuasca, you're talking about these shamans, and it's
hold on. So Kush, when you get into the Garden of Kush, and then you go into Ethiopia and the Kushites were the ones that were known for building the colossal structures and moving the big stones, and they were associated with the offspring of the fallen ones.
So there was another, because that's, again, gets into that thing where it's not necessarily inherently good or evil. It's a matter of like manipulation. And if something is good, specifically something like that is a direct work of God that's supposed to be like a heal all, something that's supposed to just to help everybody. That would be like one of the first things that you'd want to try to corrupt. So like that would make sense.
Yeah.
But
so, yeah. Well, man, it's getting pretty late. So
yeah, I was gonna say I could probably keep going with you and keep opening a new can of worms, but we'll just save it all for next time, because I'm sure you'll have something else you're diving into. And
and like you were saying in the beginning, you were like, "How many times?" I was like, "I think 3," and you're like, "No, it's been, this is the 5th time or the 5th time now, right?"
5th time, and we ran 2 hours and about 15 minutes. So I told you we're always going to guarantee to hit that 2-hour mark, and still feel like we have more to talk about.
And it goes so quick because it's a good conversation. So yeah.
Exactly. I love the conversations, man, where I don't even end up looking down at the clock at any point. I just end up looking down when it starts feeling like it's wrapping up, and I'm like, wow, it's been like 2 hours, man.
2 hours already. Yeah, for sure.
But before we start getting out here completely, man, I always like still doing the words of wisdom, and then you got to tell everybody your links where they can find everything. So before we do the links, if there's any words of wisdom you might want to bestow on the listeners today, what might it be?
Offhand, I don't know. More than anything, just from some of the stuff that's happened in my life lately, I would give some of William Burroughs' words of advice to young people. He says, be careful of whose money you pick up.
That's a good one.
Yeah. So, just in general, in all terms, yeah. So don't be tempted.
Fight temptation.
By temptation itself. Yeah. So
stay tuned, guys. This is our last break. But if you guys enjoy the show and think I deserve it, please leave a review or rating for the show on iTunes or Spotify. Your continued support is what makes this show possible, and your opinions go a long way to help the show grow and improve. So thank you. Now back with that deep conversation you crave. And then if anybody wanted to come and find your art, which is absolutely fantastic, definitely always got to spotlight that for a second, tell people to go and check it out, because I have a few of your pieces up around my house, and they're some of my favorites. So let's go and check out the art. And if people want to check out, some of the podcast stuff you're putting together, any of your channels, get more information on this book you've been working on, and, get a little bit more of a precise idea of exactly when it's coming out and everything. Where can everybody find you on the internet? How can they get a hold of you, and where can they find any of your artwork and anything else you're putting out?
Yep. So my podcast, my Patreon, my social media, my website for my artwork, as well as my podcast. You can go to Linktree RMARX, Linktree R Marx, and that'll pull up all my stuff.
And of course, I will add that down in the show description so everyone can find it quick and easy. And as usual, man, always a fantastic conversation with you. I always appreciate you coming on, spending 2 hours with me at a time. And I'm looking forward to next time, man. It's always a pleasure to have you on, and you're always welcome.
For sure. Thanks for having me on. It's always a great talk.
If you enjoyed today's conversation and want to show some love, smash that follow icon and share this episode with a friend. Or you guys can even leave a review or rating for the show on iTunes or Spotify to help me fight this algorithm battle. And if you guys leave, of course, a typed out review on iTunes, I will read it on the show and give you guys a big shout out. And if anyone would like to get in touch with me for any reason whatsoever, you guys can do so through email, which is inquiriesofallrealitypodcast@outlook.com, or through social media. Instagram and Facebook are the ones I'm the most active on. Or you guys can always go to the Linktree and fill out the submission form, and that will, of course, go directly to my email. Or you guys can also hit up the hotline number. You can either text that, call that, whatever's easier for you guys. And that number is 313-364-1551. And all of that, of course, is available down in the show notes so you guys can find it quick and easy. And if you guys have some free time, don't forget to check out the awesome friends of the show in the community. IKNOWSQUATCH, Snarly Owl Natural Products, Cryptoteeology, and Big Ape Threads. And our friends with affiliate links, Dimension Devices, Oregon-ite, and Sticker Mule, with additional discounts and credits available. More information on those, of course, is also available down in the show description. And every single thing that I mentioned throughout the show is all available off the Linktree, which again is available down in that show description. And with that, hope you guys enjoyed the conversation. Hope today's show has connected some dots in your own reality, and I'll catch you guys on the next one. Have a good night, everybody.
Reality isn't what it seems. Abductees taking aboard a craft with a tractor beam. Is life a simulation or an astral dream? Aliens travel through black holes in different galaxies. Life is a bizarre odyssey, with a mic talking about philosophy. Well, Bigfoot is stalking campers as a Wendigo walks through the woods of sharpened antlers, using a Ouija board to talk to the dead like a necromancer. There's so many questions and not enough answers. So if you're interested in mysteries and abnormalities,